So I'm a co-president of this club, and I've never given a TED Talk, so I figured it was about time I give one. So like they said, my name's Neil Goldenthal, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what I've learned from photographing the homeless. So a little bit about myself. I've been a photographer for about 2 years now. I'm currently the multimedia editor for the Spoke here at Conestoga, and I do some freelance work here and there, both photography and videography. Here's some work from this summer that I did down in New Jersey. This is a Star Trail from Phoenix, Arizona, and the March for Humanity in February in Philadelphia. So a lot of different genres of photography, but the one I'll be focusing on today is my work with the homeless. So before I get into my own, I just wanted to briefly mention a couple other significant photographers that have documented homelessness throughout the years. And the first is Tom Graylish, who was actually a staff photographer at the Philadelphia Inquirer in the 1980s. And in April 1985, he went out and documented a series that ended up being featured in the Inquirer and earned him a Pulitzer Prize the following year when he was 29. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I think he's definitely one of the earliest photographers to do this. And another that I wanted to mention is Lee Jeffries. A friend of mine showed their work to me on Instagram, and they do these really stunning, beautiful in-studio portraits of people that are just really technically beautiful, and I really like. So my own work began in Honolulu when I was there in the spring with the music department, for those of you who may have been on the trip. And so we were staying here on Waikiki, here's the beach, and we were staying at the Hyatt Place, and we were pretty much told to stay along the beach and not go anywhere further inland. But I'm not the kind of person to fly 13 hours across an ocean to stay in a 5-block stretch. So naturally, the first thing I did was go here. And my goal was to make it to the mountains that were really far inland, but I quickly hit a canal that stopped those plans. But when I hit the canal and I looked up across the street, I saw this. A homeless man, shirtless, pushing a cart, digging through the trash. And having just left the very high-end, 5-star tourist district that is Waikiki, I was really shocked. I did not expect to see something like this in such close proximity, and it really caught my attention. So over the next 5 days while we were there, I continued to document it, and I left with about 11 individual portraits that I turned into a series. And so briefly, here's a couple. This man was actually at the North Shore when we were up there for the day, so he was on the beach, camped out with his 2 dogs. This man was sitting in, this is the really high-end shopping district in Honolulu, a couple blocks from the hotel. This is right on the beach, so the sand is right there. This man was camped out, and what was interesting was he was in a really heavy area of pedestrian traffic, so a lot of people were walking by, and he had this sign out on the tree. This man was resting up, this is right along the canal. I'm actually standing in the canal when I took this, fun fact. So he was right on the Alawai Canal, which is that main canal that goes through Honolulu. And then I know this one's really dark, but that was kind of intentional because when I saw this man, we were walking back from the shops one night, and he was standing in complete darkness out of all the street lights in the shadows, and I walked up to him and asked him if I could take his picture, and he just kind of quietly nodded, and I took his picture and thanked him and walked away. And it was a really interesting interaction, but I intentionally kept the image this dark because I thought it was true to the experience. So I got a really positive reaction from that work in Honolulu, and I decided to continue it this summer while I was visiting family in Phoenix. So I got my dad to take me out and drive me around, and we pretty much just looked for homeless people, which is really fun bonding activity. So this is the first picture I took, and the thing that I really wanted to do in Phoenix that I didn't do in Honolulu because of time constraint was talk to the individuals that I was photographing and at least get their name and where they're from and some basic information. And I was lucky enough to talk to some of them for 30 minutes in some cases. But this man's name is Derek. He's 27 from North Dakota. He told me he has a young son that he spends time with. Colin, who I ended up talking to for actually maybe almost 45 minutes. He was with 2 other guys who are pictured here, and he told me that he has a degree in organic chemistry from Arizona State, and he turned to drugs after his family was killed in a car accident. So he had a really interesting backstory. Bob was with Colin. I found them behind a Circle K in the Phoenix suburbs, and they both admitted to me that they were heroin addicts. And we had a really interesting, very open conversation about the heroin crisis and how a lot of the problems they were facing there in Phoenix were similar to things that we see here back home. And it was a really great conversation. And then Dreamer, who was quite a character, came up, and he was on a bike, and I guess they were all friends, and so he came over and talked for a little bit. When he pulled out his glass pipe, that was my cue to leave. So all really interesting guys. And then these are actually from Thanksgiving when I was back in Phoenix, so a couple from that trip. This is Tim and Joseph. Joseph was a military brat, said he grew up all over the country, and his family was actually displaced after Katrina, so he's kind of been floating around, and he ran out of money in Phoenix, so he's been there for a little while. Ray from Washington State had a very interesting story about his recent divorce and some things that he had gone through in his life that he shared with me. And so this brings me to Philly, which ironically enough is the city I'm closest to and the city that I have the least amount of photos from. But I do have a couple that I would like to share. So these two guys, I actually saw them at the King of Prussia Walmart a couple months ago. I was coming out one night, I think I went to get milk or something, and Chris was sitting there. Josh wasn't with him when I walked by, and I had my camera in the car, so I ran and grabbed it. And when I came back, Josh was there too, so I talked to them for probably about 10 minutes, and I got some pictures of them. And they were the first homeless people that I talked to that introduced me to this idea that there's kind of like an underground society of people who drift between cities, which I thought was really interesting. They kind of knew this network of people across different East Coast cities because they would travel back and forth looking for work. And so there's actually a really interesting story behind this photo that I don't think I have time for. I'll try to tell it at the end if I do, but this was taken right in Center City, and this woman's name is Tanya Coleman, and my mom and I actually ran into her after dinner one night, and it's one of the only photos I've ever named. I'm not a big fan of naming my photos, but I named it Tanya's Prayer, and this wasn't for personal reasons. This was just because of the experience, and I think it's one of the most powerful photographs from the series that I've taken. And then these were actually taken last night in Suburban Station. Mr. Trainer and I were down there handing out coats and food. So these are down in Suburban. They were taken a little quickly. We were handing out stuff, and I was trying to snap pictures of people that would let me take their pictures. So I don't have names for all these people, but I thought I would share them. So I threw these in last night. And I like that one. I like the guy's hat. So I just want to talk first about a couple of the personal takeaways for me that I've experienced, because it's definitely had a profound impact on me the last couple months. And the first is to shake people's hands. I think this is like a really understated form of communication. It goes a long way. That was something that I started doing in Phoenix. I would walk up to people with a cold bottle of water, and I would have my camera tucked away just so it didn't freak them out, because a lot of people are wary of it. And so I would walk up, I'd hand them the bottle of water and put out my right hand and introduce myself. And people are always really surprised when you do that, because I think most homeless people are used to you just kind of walking by and passing and maybe, giving them some money or dropping it in a cup or a hat if they have it. And they're not used to people, reaching out and giving that slightly more intimate form of communication. And it really goes a long way, and it lets these people open up a little bit. And this is kind of a life philosophy, I guess, but never judge anyone that you don't know anything about. And I'll get into this a little later with social stigmas surrounding homelessness, but I think more often than not, we're really quick to judge people that we see on the street and use stereotypes to try to determine why they're on the street and what got them there. And often that there are a lot of factors that we don't think about and we're not aware of, and that's definitely something that I've become very conscious of after interacting with so many of these people. They have really interesting stories, and things that have led to their homelessness that I would have never imagined, and certainly aren't their fault. And the last, and this is going to tie me into the little more research-heavy part of the presentation, but to pay attention to legislation that affects the mentally ill and the homeless, because a lot of the systemic issues that I'm going to talk about are kind of rooted in legislative changes and changes in healthcare policy and things that we think about for our own personal reasons, you know, oh, how much is my healthcare cost going to go up, or is this going to affect the middle class? But we don't think about how this is going to affect the people who are most at risk for homelessness and how they're affected. And I think we really need change because 500,000 people every night in the U.S. are homeless. And this is an estimate. It's a very hard number to pin down. They use something called point-in-time counts, which come from the annual congressional reports on homelessness that are compiled. And they define some terms in here that I thought were interesting. Oh, well, first, so these are kind of the graphics they throw together for each state. So Hawaii, like I was talking about earlier, actually has one of the highest per capita rates of homelessness in the U.S. So just to give you an idea, in Pennsylvania and Arizona, it's 13 in 10,000 and 11 in 10,000 respectively, so about 5 times more per capita in Hawaii, and it's increasing quite a bit long term. It's gone down a little bit from 2016, but so anyway, these terms that I wanted to get into. So point-in-time counts, which is essentially just trying to pinpoint how many people are homeless on a given night, which is done through a variety of organizations and government agencies, and kind of work together and compile these numbers. And the second is this idea of a chronically homeless individual. And chronic homelessness is someone who has been continually homeless for 1 year or more and has a disability, but essentially just this idea of someone who is kind of caught in this cycle of homelessness and has been homeless for a long period of time. And the last is unsheltered homelessness, which is exactly what it sounds like. People who don't have shelter, they're sleeping in public places, parks, maybe government facilities that may be open at night, things like that. So I was curious about learning more about this topic from the academic standpoint, but beyond these like statistical numbers. So I contacted Dr. Dennis Culhane, who's a professor at UPenn, and I was fortunate enough to get about 20 minutes on the phone with him and talk to him about this topic. And I got 3 big takeaways from our conversation that I wanted to touch on today. And the first is that kind of this idea that homelessness will never go away. And when I asked him about whether or not he thought we would ever have a society that where homelessness is completely eradicated, he said probably not. And he said it's because homelessness is like unemployment. There are always people in between jobs, in between places. But the thing we can do is reduce the amount of time that people are homeless. So this idea of avoiding chronic homelessness. And that means having programs in place where people who become homeless can quickly, in 30 to 60 days, find housing or the financial aid that they need to get sheltered. Because if we can avoid chronic homelessness and the byproducts of that and the mental effects and the psychological effects that they can have on a person, then the long-term benefits are actually very great. And I wanted to bring in a photo that I thought was a good example of this. So this man's name is Richard. I met him over Thanksgiving in Phoenix. And for the last 2 to 3 years, Richard has been panhandling every day on the street so that he can earn $30 to stay in a motel. And he's been doing that every night for the last 2 to 3 years. And he has to spend his entire day to maybe get enough money and maybe have a little bit left over to get food. So he's stuck in this cycle where if he wants to have a roof over his head, he has to spend his entire day try to get $30 or a little more. And the second big point from my conversation with Dr. Culhane was just this fundamental difference in how the U.S. deals with healthcare versus Western European countries or Canada. And it's really because the U.S. healthcare system is based on Social Security. So when people experience the onset of mental illness, which typically happens between the ages of 18 and 25, they don't have much Social Security built up. So their access to the aid or the resources they need is very limited. Whereas in countries with universal health care or simply just more extreme healthcare systems and social programs, people have access to care, whether it's because of mental illness or because they're experiencing poverty or whatever it may be. And so they're at far less of a risk for homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And the last was the relationship between mental illness and homelessness. And just to give you guys an idea, so about 25% of homeless people experience some form of mental illness. That number is from the congressional report. But it's not fair to say that all homeless people are mentally ill or more likely to experience mental illness, and it's not fair to say that mentally ill people are more likely to experience homelessness. Like, they're too broad of generalizations to make between the two categories. There's certainly overlap, and there are correlations, but I just thought that was an interesting distinction to point out. And this brings me to this graphic that I made, which is really just made to show that there are a lot of factors that contribute to homelessness that I don't think we think about on an everyday basis. And there are so many complex factors that tie into homelessness for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different ways. And I think in reality this web is even more complex just because these things kind of feed off of each other and go back and forth. But just because the problem itself is complex, I don't think that means we need a complex solution. In fact, the solutions that I'm going to talk about, in most cases, are pretty straightforward and simple. So the first is housing vouchers, which Dr. Culhane talked about in terms of the program they're working on for veterans. So housing vouchers that they're giving out to veterans to help them get the housing assistance they need and kind of this direct aid. And he said they've seen great results from that program. So that's been working really well for that demographic. Improved social care programs in certain U.S. cities such as Philly, New York, Boston, that resemble the healthcare networks of those countries that I talked about earlier, do a better job of keeping people off the streets and reducing homelessness rates. So something as simple as just having a larger safety net in a city reduces the homelessness rate. The last government-based solution is Housing First, which is a really interesting solution that's been talked about a lot in the last couple decades. And the idea behind Housing First is that the best way to solve homelessness is to simply give homeless people houses. And the government will pay for these houses and get them the housing that they need so that they can get on their feet. And this proposal faces a lot of criticism because many people say, oh, well, why should we give homeless people free housing? We should incentivize it and make them attend certain programs or something like that. And in reality, Housing First is far cheaper than dealing with the collateral damage of having a large number of homeless people in a given area. So this was actually implemented in Utah in the early 2000s, I believe, and in 10 years they reduced the homelessness rate by about 90%. And some critics claim it's a little lower than that, but at the end of the day, they reduced the homelessness rate by a lot. And it was through this Housing First solution, so it was proven to work for them. And even a couple years after that mark was made, they've still been seeing good results from the solution. And then another is nonprofits. Nonprofits work in a lot of different ways in a lot of different capacities. The National Coalition for the Homeless has been around since 1981. It was started by a lawyer who was fighting legislation that was going to hurt the homeless and the mentally ill. So they've kind of been a good advocacy group fighting for the rights and the resources that people in these predicaments often need. And I wanted to talk about a local story actually that found on the news about a month ago. So the Rooster Soup Company is owned by two restaurant executives in Philadelphia, and they opened this additional restaurant. I believe it's their fifth or something like that. They have a lot. And they opened it so that they could donate 100% of the profits to the Broad Street Ministry, which is an organization that practices what they like to call radical hospitality. So they give out food to homeless people, but they don't just feed them. They have volunteers come in and wait on them as if they were at a restaurant. And the philosophy behind that is that they believe that giving people that experience and treating them like human beings really goes a long way and has a positive effect on them. So I thought that was a cool local story. But my point with all this is that there are plenty of solutions. It's not like we don't have a solution to this problem. But these solutions don't mean anything if we're not implementing them. And this leads me to my last point, which is that I think there's this fundamental conflict with the traditional American dream and how we see homelessness. Because, the traditional American dream is that, oh, if people work hard and they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, then they'll succeed. And dually, the problem with that is then we're inclined to see people that aren't successful or become homeless or are in a position of need as, maybe not having worked hard enough, and that they put themselves in that position. And I don't think this belief is as widespread as it used to be. I think we're starting to realize in our modern society that this isn't as easily applied as it was 100 years ago or even before that. But it really gets at this idea that we put people at a systematic disadvantage, and then we blame them for their position of need. And I think we do that for a lot of reasons. I think the core of it is really it's the easiest thing to do, and it's easier than trying to get the government to act or trying to incite change or perhaps even accepting accountability. If we're voting for legislation that is cutting aid and cutting these resources from the homeless and mentally ill, then that accountability in a way kind of comes back to us. And I think we need to change the way we're thinking about it because, if people fall off this path, it's not necessarily their fault if it's crumbling. So just to kind of wrap it up, I mean, these photographs and taking these photographs has definitely changed me. I've always been conscious of homelessness. Like, I always remember going to the city as a kid and like wondering why people were homeless, and it's just always kind of like dug at me. And like taking them and interacting with these people, talking to people who are mentally ill, who are drug addicted, who have been living on the streets, it's such a profound experience because we're used to walking by them and we treat them differently, and having this experience has really changed the way I view it. And I take these photographs, and I'm going to continue to take these photographs because I want to show everyone that they're people just like us. Thank you.